So documenting LARP as an art of experience. There's a first couple ones are actually kind of broad, just laying out what the heck that means. And kind of the basic underpinnings. If you look at the picture here, this is actually from a legit gallery show of LARP artifacts, which is why it says Artifact 2015, which was in Israel. Which is what I found out about that while I was working on this, and there were numerous times working on this presentation where I was almost done, and then someone would tell me something really cool, and it would add 2 days to me working on it. And that was one of them. This is an amazing, amazing experience that went on. Some of them I had more familiarity with, like New World Magiscola, which most people recognize as Maury's kind of baby, as the American equivalent to College of Wizardry. You can see me hanging on the back being Chancellor. It's cool times. So, one of the things that I want to talk about is how we understand LARPs to be. They're difficult to document, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's 5 reasons that Stenros and Mamantola identify, which is that they're subjective, so you have numerous personal experiences, that they're co-creative, so they have a certain emergent quality, even if they're fairly tightly scripted, that they're aimed at the first-person audience. A lot of the things that you can catch with a camera are not representative of what it was. The ephemeral, they happen and they're gone, and have a loosely defined purpose. Even when you think as a LARP designer or a writer or even as a player that it means one thing, it can actually change meaning while you're playing, or even later you can look back at it and it has a different meaning than it did when you played it, or a wide variety of things. Also, as Lizzie has pointed out, LARPs can't be relived, and anecdotes gamers tell each other afterward sound like inside jokes to anyone who wasn't there. This is something I'm guessing most everyone in this room has had an experience with. You had to be there. It was amazing. Dude. Any of those variations. Video documentation of LARPs typically portray a linear narrative that focuses on mimetic qualities rather than what it felt like to individuals. They often use this for a commercial. So they're conveying the story of the LARP. And what this is a single strong narrative. And we're like, would you like to be a part of a submarine attacking, I don't know, fairylands, a magical college, a group of artists living in the time of beatniks, what have you. It's easier to talk about a single narrative if, in fact, inaccurate, because it doesn't do a great deal of what I've already covered. So part of this, for me, is separating out whether a LARP is a story or a LARP is an experience. Now, I want to clarify that this is for me. I absolutely believe that there's actually, I've been talking about this recently, as in the past 2 days, so it's legit another thing that could have been in my presentation but isn't, a certain amount of bleed between concepts rather than between experiences. There is narrative elements to LARP, but I don't, in my heart of hearts, feel that LARP is a narrative. Narrative, in just a straight description, is a person telling something to another person for some kind of purpose. And rather than an emergent thing. Life happens, and then afterwards you tell someone what happened in your life, and that is you telling the story of your life. Your life itself was not the story. But they can contain a narrative architecture. I put that term in my paper, and the day after it was due and I turned it in, this meme popped up on a big conversation, which is basically making fun of the term narrative architecture as something that's kind of dated. I figured, whatever, I'm going to own it. I still like the term. Another thing I want to point out, and several people have heard me say this, is that the goal in theater specifically is to have an audience take you as a character or a situation that you're portraying as being a situation. Not necessarily real, but it's exogenous goal. Whereas the goal of a LARP is for you to play the character. You play the character to play the character, that is the goal. Other people taking you as the character certainly facilitates that goal, but It ain't about them. I also want to talk a little bit about embodied experiences. So I'm talking about here as the art form itself being an experience. And Johanna says that LARPs are an art of experience, which is a great phrase. A thing which must be situated in lived experience to be understood. This opens them to being framed as embodied experiences, which is a term Patricia Levy, who's a big arts-based researcher, has talked about. And these can be used to generate data, provide analysis, but they have a couple of common attributes, that the practitioners are simultaneously the medium and the artwork. You can see this in dance, you can see it in theater, you can see it in LARP. They're different, but they have these connections. They include sensory output and input that mirror social phenomena that intersect with culture, identity, and the flow of power. At this point in this conference, I don't feel like I need to clarify that. They must be experienced to be in existence. That's part of the ephemerality. It's part of the experience. And they exist only as a memory once they are completed. You can see on a picture there from Beat Generation.
What's with the look?
Like, literally, I was putting the last slide in, and then all these pictures come up, and they're like, here's stuff from Beat Generation. And I'm like, God dang it. And it added 2 more days to me putting this presentation together. Because, to talk a moment about this picture, Eric was playing John Cage. Eric had this idea where people could walk in on John Cage doing creative process. And he had been saying a lot when people said, what are you working on? I'm really into water. So he went into the tub and started playing with the water and throwing cards in it and using a bucket and playing with it. And the thing is, he got really into water. And so people walked in and saw him doing it, but he did not notice. Originally, he was doing it as, in fact, a performance because he was helping facilitate the LARP. Eventually, it was not a performance. It was an embodied experience where he was experimenting with John Cage concepts in the persona of John Cage. That was the artistic experience. Other people benefited from it. They splintered off. They had their own perceptions, their own individual journeys, all these unique experiences that are simultaneously linked through the context of the LARP and yet remain individual, valuable, and meaningful. So, this is kind of complex stuff here that I did not give enough time in the presentation because I realized I gave a whole presentation on this concept. In this room, there's actually someone who saw it, which is Anna. Yay, Anna! Because I gave a presentation about ways of framing LARPs as a new epistemology using a rhizomatic structure in Russia. So unless you were in Russia, which in here is Anna, and Yitomas saw it, but he's not here today, you don't already know this stuff. So the difference is this. If you have most games that you've seen, like video game or anything like that, they have a very linear track. Here's the main plot, here's your sub-quest, here's your side quest, blah, 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 blah. And then at the end, there's the great big fight and everyone gets together and hooray, the LARP's over. So there's this one big linear track. A rhizomatic structure sees things as relationships. Certainly there is that plot, but it's not actually linear. It's more like a tangle of different lines. And while that main plot is going on, you have gone off and discovered that another person is related to you, and then you're having a confrontation. Maybe you're sitting silently crying in the corner, and that's incredibly meaningful. And in a lot of presentations of LARP documentation, these are considered secondary. And in my opinion, that is an absolute mistake. Because those are the things that make the LARP meaningful for the individual players. If you want to get a sense of what that experience is, you don't just talk about the big part. If I wanted to talk about what riots are like, I don't just talk about what happened during a riot. If I want to talk about an amazing concert, I can say who was on stage. But what it meant to an individual person, or where they met someone that they care about, or what have you, those are part of what makes it meaningful. Otherwise, you're just listing events. So part of the way that I talk about doing this is thinking about a couple different things. For one thing, the LARP itself is kind of a social object. And then within that, you have things people make. And this is a collaboration in many ways between the context and the player. So the first time I was aware of this was Wands for New World Magiscola, where people spent time, or they bought a thing, or they made a thing, or what have you, and it was invested with meaning, both personal meaning and diegetic meaning, where they got the wand from. And they would bring it in with having put all this thought and time into their wands, or their outfits, or the objects that they made to engage with the LARP. And very few people would ask them about it, but it meant a lot to them. And then after the LARP, I asked one, I was like, I was wondering, does anyone want to talk about their wands? And I had like, the next day, there were like 70 responses with pictures, and it was amazing. And that is one of the things where I started to realize how much those small objects, and apparently, but not actually, small stories started to matter. Another example of this I got from one of the WeirdCon companions, where this LARPer, Quinn D, had chosen to play an artist, not thinking of themselves, in fact, as an artist, and made wire sculptures. And they had both a diegetic effect and an effect outside of the LARP. They weren't always props or even art. Sometimes they were story, experiences, feelings, and they had a life past the limits of the magic circle, where people have them in treasured places in their homes, where people look on them and reflect on the times or the characters or what have you. So the object is not actually defined by what it's made of or media, but the discourse that it generates and is a part of. And these go on. They are, even though the object apparently doesn't change, the meaning is actually an emergent thing that goes on as time goes on, as people change, as the LARP changes, and ends up being referential. So to get a little bit into art theory, I use the terms praxis, poiesis, and aesthesis. These are kind of obscure terms that unless you're really into art theory, you probably don't know. Except for praxis, oddly enough. Everybody knows praxis. Because praxis is creation as an exercise of intent. I meant to do this thing, I have done this thing. Praxis. In the United States, we're real focused on praxis because we love intent. My God. Which is not a bad thing, except if you do it without considering other aspects. Poiesis is a visceral experience of making. So I'm in the moment of 3D printing my wand or carving my wand, or I ordered it from a friend on Etsy or what have you. I see something that's amazing on Pinterest and I recreate it. So that is all invested meaning through those qualities. And aesthesis is a sensorial experience one has an encounter with an artifact. And these can be multiple things, but as the Chancellor, for instance, I had a ridiculously long wand. It was practically a short sword. It made it hard to sit down, but it felt like a symbol of authority because it was impractical in that sense. There's a point where someone else had broken their wand and I loaned them mine for half a day. And they're like, "Are you serious?" I'm like, "Yes, of course, you can't study without your wand. Yeah, take mine." And they're like, "I'll make you one." I'm like, "All right, that's fine." All right. Another thing about this is when I'm starting to talk about documenting using these objects, I start thinking about it in terms of museums, because I'm an art guy, in terms of how we curate those. I brought this up with a friend, actually Evan Torner, and there is an older concept of museum as a tome in which artifacts go to die. Let's see, they are entombed for all times and they're just be safe, locked up in a mausoleum of meaning that is lost. That is an older concept of museums that is sadly still prevalent in some museums, not all of them. But newer museums are actually more keen on being participatory, where they want people that are there to engage with objects as cultural participants, not as people just consuming work that is shoved in their face. A recognition that meaning can change over time. So there's even, I note here the interactive experience model, which one of the things that's going on here is that the museums are increasingly thinking about experience design in engaging with them. So what I am suggesting in part, and I think I come back to this in a moment, is that when you are working to document objects, it makes the most sense to present them in a way that is itself an experience. It is an experience that is separate but related to the LARPs that we're talking about. So you have to think about the experience of the person who's engaging with it. Man, this is so much stuff. I'm gonna have to speed myself up a little. So that I have time to talk about everything, I'm gonna skip forward a little bit. So there's different ways that this has been done. If you haven't read Nordic LARP, you should. It's an awesome book. But when they're doing things, they do collect participant data in terms of narratives, but they're focusing on the creator and kind of that large subject that I'm talking about, which is fine. Again, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with the linear model, but it foregrounds a different kind of understanding. If I'm trying to understand what the experience was like, I kind of want to get a little bit more broad. Awesome book, tells you a lot about a wide range of LARPs, gives you a lot of insight, and the work that I'm doing here could not exist without them. But I'm suggesting a different kind of format. Another example is, so here I call it artifact collection as reflection. The LARP is over, we're looking back, this is kind of what it was. This one here, I'm talking about art as a mechanic in a LARP. For instance, there's Beat Generation, where people were creating art as a part of it. Even people who did not consider themselves to be artists were making kind of inspired art and then sticking it up to the wall. And above that, you can see there's a ritual-based LARP called This Miracle, where part of what you did was made objects that were going to be important for religion. So these are artifacts that are made as a part of the LARP. They're made with whatever the organizer has brought. They're treated with complete sincerity. They're significant to the game in many ways. How these are preserved afterwards, what they mean coming in, they're a little bit different. So let's go through here. And then I've got formal exhibitions of LARP artifacts. So my two examples here are, one, the museum show I talked about before, which was in Israel. It sounds like a great show. It now exists only in photos. Slight problem in the sense that because it's in a physical space, you had to be able to travel there to see it. And also, it's more practical if you're in a relatively small country, where you can get a whole lot of objects, rather than a very large country, where that's kind of a hard thing to do. It's hard to travel there, it's hard to collect the objects. And another example here I have is Janea's work, which is she collects objects for her autoethnography. Stuff she's given, stuff she made, she makes Pinterest boards, she puts together music, and she uses all of these as a tool to encompass her personal experience. It's very similar to what I'm talking about, but very focused on one person at a time because it's autoethnography rather than presenting multiple perspectives to an audience. The last example is my first attempt to try and do something like what I'm talking about. It is, I will say, imperfect. But by God, I tried. So I collected different artifacts from people who played New World Magiscola. They volunteered them to me. I put up a submission sheet. I photoshopped them so that they would fit within a frame. I collected all the information that goes on them. I built it on a Wix site from scrap, but I should have used Omeka, it turns out, which I hadn't heard of at that point. And it has a lot of information. It's got some limitations, the chief one being that I curated and have complete power over it. There's no space for discourse. There's also nothing that causes a viewer to want to invest themselves. So it ends up being a little bit like a wiki. You know, there's a resource there if you want it, but it's not something you're going to go to like, say, you would Imgur, to throw a name out there. Imgur is a visual discourse. That is what Imgur is. It requires moderation, which I was uncomfortable doing at that point because I'm like, I have no time. But it is required to have the investment necessary to make this a living exhibition if you're going to be online. My conclusion here is real small. Also, I love that typewriter. Main point, collections of player artifacts, effective documentation of LARPs as an art of experience. My feeling is the best way to represent LARPs as experiences is to consider the participant experience of the documentation itself, focusing on them as co-creators. We have a tendency to kind of think of the designer as the primary visionary, the auteur, such like, I feel like when we do that, we give short shrift to the players and the dedication, the involvement, the energy, the thought that they have put into things. I touch here on praxis, poesis, and aesthesis because they support different applications of the research. There's more than one way to document a LARP. There's more than one way to present that documentation. It's difficult to gauge best practices for this because, frankly, there aren't that many exhibitions of LARP artifacts. There's Facebook. People put up a lot of pictures on Facebook. There's websites, which most of the time end up being commercials. Formal presentations is something we haven't done much of, but I think that we should. I hope it's a significant study as a starting of the conversation. I hope I'm not alone in it. And I'm still looking at other ways of doing this. It's probably still going to be web-based because the United States is a big place and I would rather it was international. So a physical collection is for my purposes, not as practical. And I also want to create a higher degree of community investment. And that is me.